The heavy wooden door creaked shut behind Marguerite, and suddenly she found herself alone in the bridal chamber for the first time since dawn broke over the ancient stones of Château de Montclair. The flickering candlelight from dozens of beeswax candles cast dancing shadows across the stone walls, their warm glow barely penetrating the deep recesses of the chamber that would now be her sanctuary and prison combined. She could still hear the distant sounds of revelry from the great hall 3 floors below. Laughter, the scraping of chairs, the occasional burst of song from the minstrels her father had hired for the occasion. Her wedding feast had been truly magnificent, a display of wealth and power that had taken months to plan. Lords and ladies from across the realm had traveled for weeks to witness her union with Sir Edmund de Vere, their colorful banners and rich garments transforming the usually austere castle into something from a troubadour's tale. The tables had groaned under the weight of roasted peacocks, honeyed cakes, and wine from the finest vineyards of France. But now, as the celebration continued without her, came the part that truly terrified her, the mysterious duties that every bride of noble birth was expected to fulfill before dawn painted the eastern sky. Her fingers trembled as she touched the small piece of aged parchment her mother had pressed into her palm just before the ceremony, the yellowed vellum crackling softly under her touch. The ink was faded but still legible, written in the careful script of her grandmother, who had received the same instructions from her own mother decades earlier. The 5 sacred duties, her mother had whispered urgently, her eyes darting around to ensure they weren't overheard by the bustling wedding party. You must perform them all before the first cock crows at dawn, or your marriage will be cursed with 7 years of misfortune. Our family has observed these rituals for generations, child. Do not be the one to break the chain. Marguerite had barely had time to ask what these duties entailed before the wedding procession began, the sound of horns and drums drowning out any possibility of further conversation. And now, at 17 years old, having been married for barely 6 hours, she found herself faced with mysterious obligations that could determine not only her own fate, but that of any children she might bear. The weight of generations of women who had stood in similar chambers performing these same secret rituals pressed down upon her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The first duty, according to the aged parchment written in her grandmother's careful script, was to cleanse the threshold with blessed salt and ancient prayer, that no demon nor evil spirit may cross into the sacred space of union. Marguerite had managed to secret away a small leather pouch of precious salt from the kitchen earlier that day, hiding it beneath her chemise, where the cook's eagle eyes couldn't detect it. Salt was worth its weight in silver, and taking it without permission was a serious transgression, but the ritual demanded it be stolen, not given freely. Now she knelt by the massive iron-bound door, her elaborate burgundy wedding gown spreading around her like spilled wine. The fabric was the finest silk from Constantinople, embroidered with threads of real gold that caught the candlelight with every movement. As she sprinkled the white crystals in a careful line across the threshold, she whispered the ancient Latin words her grandmother had taught her during long winter evenings by the fire. Sal benedictus protege hunc locum, sanctum ab omnibus malis. The prayer felt strange on her tongue, older somehow than the familiar church Latin she knew from Mass. This was something deeper, more primal, a protection spell that predated Christianity itself, though generations of pious wives had cloaked it in Christian language to ease their consciences. As she rose from her knees, carefully brushing salt crystals from the rich fabric of her gown, Marguerite heard the distinctive sound of heavy boots on the stone stairs leading to the tower chamber. Her heart seized with sudden panic. Surely Edmund wouldn't come so soon. The celebration below was still in full swing, and tradition demanded that the groom drink with the men until the early hours of morning. She quickly moved to the second duty, her hands shaking, as she unfolded the parchment once more. Place 7 drops of golden honey beneath the marriage bed, that sweetness may flow through all your years together even in times of hardship and want. The small clay pot of honey had been easy enough to procure. Her personal maid, loyal Isabel, had helped her gather all the necessary items throughout the day without asking too many questions. The honey was from her father's own beehives, thick and amber-colored, carrying the scent of the wildflower meadows of her childhood home. As she crouched beneath the massive four-poster bed that dominated the chamber, a monstrous thing carved with scenes of hunting and warfare that spoke more to masculine tastes than feminine sensibilities. She felt the weight of leaving everything familiar behind. The small clay pot of honey felt heavy in her trembling hands as she positioned herself beneath the ornate bed frame. 1, 2, 3. She counted each golden drop as it fell to the fresh rushes scattered on the stone floor, releasing their sweet fragrance into the air. This ritual was said to ensure that even during the inevitable hardships that came to every marriage, failed harvests, political upheavals, the loss of children, the couple would remember the initial sweetness of their love and find their way back to each other. 4, 5, 6, 7. Each drop seemed to carry a prayer, a hope for the future that felt both impossibly distant and frighteningly immediate. The footsteps she had heard proved to be only a servant carrying fresh linens to another chamber, and Marguerite breathed a sigh of relief as the sounds faded away down the corridor. She had more time, but not much. The third duty proved far more challenging both physically and emotionally. Burn a lock of your maiden hair while speaking your husband's true name thrice, that your old self may die and your new self be born in the flames. Marguerite's thick auburn hair had been her greatest vanity and her mother's pride. Since childhood, it had grown long and lustrous, reaching nearly to her waist when unbound. Even now elaborately braided and pinned for her wedding, it represented the last vestige of her girlhood. The small eating knife she drew from her belt, a wedding gift from her father, its handle carved with her family's coat of arms, felt sacrilegious in her hands as she selected a curl from behind her left ear where the loss would be least noticeable. She held the lock over one of the chamber's many candles, watching as the flames consumed what had been part of her since birth. "Edmund de Vere," she whispered, as the hair crackled and burned. "Edmund de Vere, Edmund de Vere." The acrid smoke seemed to carry away her old life, the carefree days of her girlhood disappearing forever into the night air. By now the revelry below had grown quieter, and Marguerite knew her time was running short. The fourth duty required her to write your new name in wine upon the window-sill. With shaking hands, she dipped her finger into the goblet of deep red wine that had been left for the newlyweds. The cold stone felt rough beneath her fingertip as she carefully traced out Marguerite de Vere on the narrow sill. The wine looked almost black in the candlelight, like dried blood, and she shivered at the thought. The final duty was the most mysterious of all. Speak aloud your greatest fear, then bury it beneath the hearthstone. Marguerite stared at the words, her mind racing. What was her greatest fear? That Edmund would find her lacking? That she would fail to produce heirs? That she would never see her beloved family again, now that she lived so far from home? But as she stood there in the flickering light, surrounded by the evidence of ancient rituals, she realized her deepest fear was something else entirely, that she would lose herself completely in this new role as wife and lady of the castle, that the girl who had once run wild through her father's orchards, who had dreamed of traveling to distant lands and learning to read the stars, would disappear entirely beneath the weight of duty and expectation. "I fear that I will forget who I was," she whispered to the empty chamber, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "I fear that Marguerite, daughter of Lord Henry, will die tonight and never be seen again." The words seemed to hang in the air like incense, heavy and meaningful. Then, following the ancient instructions, she knelt by the great stone hearth and used her eating knife to scrape at the mortar between two stones. Into the small crevice she had created, She tucked a piece of parchment on which she had written her fear. She sealed it with melted wax from one of the candles, then pressed the mortar back into place. Just as she finished, she heard Edmund's distinctive footsteps approaching the door. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she quickly hid the parchment with the ritual instructions in her jewelry box and smoothed down her gown. The 5 sacred duties were complete, but she felt no sense of relief, only a strange mixture of loss and anticipation. The door opened slowly, and Edmund stepped into the chamber. At 25 he was considered quite handsome, with dark hair and kind eyes that had drawn her attention even during their brief courtship. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene, the salt scattered by the threshold, the lingering scent of burned hair, the wine stain on the window-sill. "An interesting evening's work," he said gently, and Marguerite's cheeks burned with embarrassment. Had he guessed what she'd been doing? Would he think her foolish for following the old ways? But Edmund's expression was understanding, not mocking. "My own grandmother left me certain instructions as well," he admitted, producing a small scroll from his belt. "Something about placing an iron nail under the bed and reciting my lineage to the 4 winds." Marguerite felt a laugh bubble up from her chest, the first genuine emotion she'd experienced all day. "Did you complete your duties as well, my lord?" "Everyone," he said with a slight smile, "though I confess I felt rather foolish speaking to the winds from the battlements. The guards must think their new lord has taken leave of his senses." They stood there for a moment, 2 young people bound by ancient traditions and family expectations, yet finding in each other a spark of understanding. The candlelight played across Edmund's face, and Marguerite realized that perhaps her greatest fear, losing herself, might not come to pass after all. Perhaps instead she might discover new parts of herself she had never known existed. "Tell me," Edmund said, settling into one of the chairs by the fire, "what was your greatest fear that you buried tonight? For I suspect that was part of your ritual, as it was of mine." And so, as the wedding night settled around them like a comfortable cloak, Marguerite found herself speaking honestly for the first time in months. She told him about her fear of losing her identity, about her dreams of learning and traveling, about the girl she had been, and the woman she hoped to become. Edmund listened carefully, occasionally asking thoughtful questions, and in return shared his own fears about living up to his father's legacy and ruling his lands with wisdom and justice. As dawn approached, painting the chamber windows with soft pink light, they were still talking. The 5 sacred duties had been completed, the old ways honored, and the future secured according to ancient wisdom. But more than that, 2 strangers had begun the delicate process of becoming partners, not just in name and law, but in truth. The marriage bed remained undisturbed that first night, but something far more precious had been consummated in that stone chamber. A meeting of minds and hearts that would in time grow into the deep love that the honey drops had been meant to ensure. The salt had protected them from evil, the wine had sealed their new beginning, and the burned hair had carried away the last vestiges of their separate lives. And buried beneath the hearthstone, 2 pieces of parchment lay side by side. 2 fears that would, over the years, prove to be groundless as Marguerite and Edmund built a marriage based not on duty alone, but on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the kind of love that even the ancient rituals could only hope to invoke.